Remember when flying across Europe actually felt special? When hopping between countries wasn't just about getting from A to B, but about the experience itself. You'd step onto the plane, hear a mix of languages, feel that quiet excitement, as if the journey mattered just as much as the destination. Today, that feeling is fading fast. Flights are delayed or cancelled with a single notification. Cabins feel tighter every year. Airlines charge extra for basics that used to be included, turning simple trips into a maze of fees and frustration. The excitement disappeared, while the experience became even more stressful. So here's the real question: which European airlines are still worth flying? And which ones have quietly become a gamble? In this video, we ranked 15 major European airlines, from the ones you should avoid at all costs to the few that still deliver a reliable, human experience. And let me tell you, number 15 on our list is an airline you've heard countless stories about, from once joking about paid bathrooms to seriously floating the idea of standing seats. Yet millions of people keep booking it anyway. Do you know the name already? Number 15. Ryanair. Ryanair isn't really an airline, it's more like a social experiment to see how much inconvenience humans will tolerate in exchange for a cheap ticket. On paper, it's brilliant. Rock-bottom fares, an enormous network, and planes that land and take off with military precision. But once you step on board, you quickly realize the goal isn't comfort, it's survival. Flying Ryanair feels less like travel and more like being processed. Boarding resembles a competitive sport where the prize is overhead bin space you already paid for. The seats are so tight they make economy class on legacy airlines feel like a lounge. And the cabin atmosphere, somewhere between a bus station and a late-night game show, complete with loud announcements selling scratch cards, perfumes, and the occasional reminder that nothing is free. Then there are the famous ideas. Paid bathrooms, standing seats, charging you for breathing might be next. One frequent flyer joked, "Ryanair doesn't hate passengers, they just see us as cargo that complains." Funny, because it doesn't feel entirely wrong. To be fair, Ryanair often gets you there on time. That's the paradox. The airline is ruthlessly efficient, and delays are sometimes less common than on much more expensive carriers. But when something does go wrong, the experience collapses fast. Customer service becomes invisible. Rebooking feels like a scavenger hunt, and refunds exist mostly in theory. Ryanair works if your expectations are low and your plans are flexible. For a quick weekend hop with a backpack, it can be tolerable. But for anyone who values comfort, clarity, or basic dignity, this is the airline that reminds you how far flying has fallen. And what about you? Was your Ryanair flight just a cheap, no-nonsense hop, or did it turn into one of those stories people warn their friends about? Drop your experience in the comments. Your insight might help another traveler avoid the same mistake. And now, let's move on to the airline that narrowly avoided taking this last place. Because if Ryanair feels like endurance flying, the next one isn't much more comfortable, it just complains less loudly. Number 14. Wizz Air. If Ryanair feels like flying on a dare, Wizz Air feels like flying through fine print. At first glance, it looks more civilized. Newer aircraft, clean purple branding, and routes that promise cheap access to parts of Europe most airlines ignore. It seems like the smarter budget choice. Often it isn't. Wizz Air runs an extremely lean operation, especially across Central and Eastern Europe. That efficiency works when everything goes perfectly. But when delays or cancellations appear, the system has very little flexibility. Flights are infrequent, alternatives are limited, and communication tends to vanish exactly when passengers need it most. On board, the experience is purely functional. Seats are tight, legroom is minimal, and the cabin feels more like public transport than air travel. The real frustration begins before boarding. The pricing structure is complicated and aggressively enforced. Carry-on rules vary by ticket type, seat selection costs extra, and what looked like a bargain at checkout often creeps closer to the price of a traditional airline once essentials are added. Unlike Ryanair, Wizz Air doesn't lean into humor or self-awareness. There's no wink to the passenger, no acknowledgement that the discomfort is intentional. That makes the experience feel colder, particularly for older travelers or first-time visitors to Europe who expect at least basic guidance. To its credit, Wizz Air operates a relatively young fleet, and when flights run smoothly, the journey itself is uneventful, which is the best compliment you can give it. But reliability is the gamble. With limited backups, even small disruptions can spiral into major delays. If this has surprised you so far, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel and tells me you want more breakdowns like this. And now, let's move on to another airline on our list. What's the story there? Number 13. EasyJet. This airline often benefits from comparison, not because it's good, but because others are worse. For many travelers, booking it feels like a small victory. You didn't choose the harshest low-cost carrier. You chose the one that seems more organized, more predictable, more grown up, and that perception matters until it's tested. On a normal day, everything feels orderly. The process makes sense. Gates are calm, boarding is structured, and nothing immediately signals trouble. The problem is that this sense of control is thin. Once schedules tighten or weather disrupts the network, the cracks appear quickly. Delays don't explode, they linger. Information arrives slowly, often incomplete. Rebooking exists, but it feels mechanical rather than helpful. You're moved through a system that prioritizes flow, not individual problems. It's not chaos, it's quiet frustration. For American travelers especially, this can be unsettling. You expect that a larger, more established airline will step in when plans unravel. Instead, you realize the operation is designed to keep moving forward, not to recover gracefully. There's a plan, but very little flexibility. It rarely creates disaster-level stories, which is why it avoids the very bottom of the list. But it also doesn't earn trust when things go wrong. It survives on being less bad, not on being reliable. And in European air travel, that difference matters. Number 12. Vueling. This is the kind of airline that looks perfectly fine, right up until you actually need it. Nothing about the booking raises red flags. The price feels reasonable, the airports are familiar, and the branding suggests something closer to a proper European carrier than a pure budget gamble. And then something changes. The biggest weakness here isn't comfort or even delays. It's how quickly control disappears when plans stop being ideal. Information becomes inconsistent. One screen says one thing, the app says another, and staff on the ground often seem just as unsure as the passengers. You're not told what's happening. You're left to piece it together. This airline operates heavily through congested hubs, where tight turnarounds leave no margin for error. When everything lines up, the flight feels routine. But when schedules slip, the operation struggles to recover. Gate changes pile up, boarding pauses without explanation. Small problems stretch far longer than they should. What keeps this airline above the bottom tier is that flights usually do go. You'll likely arrive, eventually. But the journey often feels reactive rather than managed. And now let's move to number 11, an airline that mixes warm Southern European hospitality with serious operational inconsistency. It promises charm and tradition, but too often delivers strikes, shifting schedules, and long waits with very few answers. Number 11. TAP Air Portugal. For many travelers, this airline feels like a gateway to Europe. Lisbon is a natural crossroads, routes are attractive, and the idea of flying a national carrier comes with an assumption of structure and reliability. On paper, it makes sense. In practice, that confidence is often misplaced. The defining issue here is inconsistency. Not every flight is a problem. Far from it. Some journeys are perfectly smooth, even pleasant. The trouble is how unpredictable the experience can be. Schedules shift, connections tighten, and disruptions seem to hit harder than they should. When labor tensions rise, strikes appear with frustrating regularity, and passengers are left scrambling. What makes this especially difficult is the response when things go wrong. Information is slow to surface. Answers vary depending on who you ask. Rebooking can feel improvised rather than coordinated. You're often told to wait and then wait some more, with little clarity about what's actually happening behind the scenes. For American travelers using Portugal as a stepping stone into Europe, this can be exhausting. You expect a flag carrier to take control during disruption. Instead, you often find yourself navigating policies, apps, and airport desks on your own, piecing together solutions that should already exist. This airline isn't broken. It's unreliable at the moments that matter most, and that's why it sits here, not at the bottom, but far from where a national carrier should be. Number 10. ITA Airways. This airline lives in an awkward in-between state. It wants to be seen as modern and forward-looking, yet it carries the weight of a long, very public history that passengers haven't forgotten. The result is an experience that often feels more like a rebrand than a reinvention. Visually, everything looks right. The cabins feel fresh, the uniforms are sharp, and the overall presentation clearly aims to reset expectations. On board, crews often bring warmth and personality, leaning into a distinctly Italian sense of hospitality. When things are calm, the flight can feel pleasant, even charming. The problem isn't what happens in the air, it's what happens around it. Decisions feel cautious, responses feel slow. When plans change, the airline doesn't take command of the situation. It manages it politely. You're not ignored, but you're not decisively guided either. There's a sense that solutions are being assembled in real time, rather than pulled from a well-rehearsed playbook. That gap between expectation and reality creates a quiet sense of doubt. You expect a national carrier to project authority and certainty. Instead, you get an airline that feels like it's still earning that confidence, asking passengers to trust the process rather than the outcome. This airline isn't stuck in the past, but it hasn't fully escaped it either. And until that identity gap closes, flying with it feels like participating in a transition rather than relying on a finished product. And now we move to the next airline, one that didn't collapse overnight but slowly drifted away from the standard it once set. It used to represent the very best of European flying, yet today that standard is harder to recognize in practice. Number 9. SAS Scandinavian. This airline built its reputation on calm. For years, flying with it felt orderly, quiet, almost minimalist. Everything followed rules that made sense. Nothing flashy, nothing chaotic, just a smooth, controlled experience that didn't demand your attention. That identity hasn't disappeared, but it has thinned. Over time, pressure has started to show through the cracks. Financial strain, restructuring, and repeated labor disputes have subtly reshaped how the airline operates. You don't always notice it immediately. The change reveals itself in small moments, slower responses, fewer options, a sense that the system is operating with less breathing room than before. When flights run as planned, the experience remains composed. Crews are professional, the atmosphere is calm, and nothing feels overtly wrong. But when schedules slip, that famous sense of control weakens. Adjustments take longer. Solutions feel limited. The airline no longer absorbs disruption the way it once did. What makes this noticeable is contrast. Expectations are still high because the brand memory is strong. When reality doesn't fully match that memory, frustration creeps in. Not because something is terrible, but because it no longer feels effortless. This airline hasn't fallen apart. It has lost momentum. Flying it today feels like watching a system that still works, but with more friction than before. Everything moves forward, just with a little more resistance and a little less confidence than its reputation suggests. Next comes an airline that should feel warmer, more relaxed, almost effortless. Sun-washed hubs, a slower rhythm, and a national carrier that leans more on tradition than urgency. When everything runs smoothly, it feels pleasant, but when it doesn't, patience becomes part of the ticket. Number 8. Iberia. This airline feels like it knows exactly what it wants to be, but only some of the time. On its main routes and flagship services, everything looks deliberate, the branding is confident, the presentation polished, and the airline clearly wants to be seen as a serious European player with long-haul ambitions. The experience changes once you move outside that spotlight. Short and mid-haul flights often feel like an afterthought. The journey is treated less as an experience and more as a logistical step inside a much larger system. As long as you fit neatly into that system, things work fine. The moment you don't, a tight connection, a schedule change, an unusual request, the limits become visible. A lot of this comes down to priorities. The operation is built around hubs, efficiency, and flow. Passenger experience isn't ignored, but it isn't central either. Communication tends to be factual and minimal. You're told what's happening, not walked through it. There's little sense of adjustment or personalization. Interactions reflect that mindset. Crews are professional but rarely engaging. When issues arise, the response feels procedural rather than proactive. You're moved through steps, policies, and counters in a way that keeps things orderly, but not necessarily reassuring. This airline doesn't feel chaotic or unreliable. It feels institutional. Flying it often leaves you with the impression that the system worked exactly as designed, just without much concern for how it felt from your seat. You'll likely get where you're going, but the journey rarely leaves a positive impression. After all that structure and procedure, the next airline comes from a warmer, more personal culture. Service feels friendlier, interactions less rigid, but organization sometimes takes a back seat. It's more pleasant than precise, and that trade-off isn't always worth it. Number 7. Aer Lingus. At first glance, this airline feels like a welcome break from the cold corporate tone of European aviation. Interactions are friendlier, announcements sound less robotic, and the overall atmosphere suggests that someone still remembers passengers are people, not just seat numbers. That warmth, however, comes with a cost. Operational discipline isn't always its strong suit. Processes feel looser, decisions less decisive, and follow-through can be uneven. When something deviates from the plan, responses tend to be slow and informal rather than structured. Problems don't escalate, they linger. Communication is another weak point. Information is often delivered calmly, but not always clearly. Updates can be vague, and passengers are sometimes left guessing what the next step actually is. One frequent flyer joked, "Aer Lingus is very polite about delays. You just won't know how long they'll last." The airline also struggles with positioning. It's priced above low-cost carriers, yet doesn't consistently deliver the level of organization or Polish people expect at that price point. Expectations rise, but the experience doesn't always follow. Crews are rarely unfriendly, but they don't always appear empowered to solve problems quickly. You get reassurance instead of resolution, which is comforting only up to a point. When timing matters, that relaxed approach can quickly become frustrating. Flying it often feels pleasant until you need firm answers or fast decisions. And that's why it sits here. Easier to like than many airlines below it, but still too loose to fully rely on when things get complicated. Next comes an airline almost everyone has flown at least once or seriously considered. Think of a famous flag on the tail, a main hub just outside London, and crews trained to apologize before they explain. Do you know the name already? Number 6. British Airways. This is an airline people assume they understand. It feels familiar before you even book it. The branding signals tradition, the accents signal authority, and the whole experience carries the quiet promise that things will be handled properly. That promise is doing a lot of work. The biggest issue here isn't chaos or neglect, it's stagnation. While competitors invested heavily in modern cabins, sharper service models, and clearer passenger communication, this airline leaned on its legacy. The result is an experience that feels dated in places, especially when compared to newer global rivals. Long-haul flights can still be perfectly acceptable, particularly in premium cabins. But consistency is uneven. Some aircraft feel refreshed, others feel like they've been stretched well past their prime. The difference between what you expect and what you get can be noticeable depending on the route and plane. Operationally, the airline struggles most at its main hub. Congestion, staffing issues, and frequent disruptions have become part of the experience. When things go wrong, responses often feel polite but slow. You get apologies quickly, solutions less so. The tone is professional but distant. Crews rarely feel unfriendly, yet interactions can feel formal rather than reassuring. There's an assumption that passengers will accept inconvenience as long as it's delivered politely. This airline still benefits enormously from name recognition and network strength. That reputation carries passengers a long way. But flying it today often feels like relying on a system that hasn't fully adapted to how competitive global aviation has become. And now we enter the top 5 airlines that actually deliver what most passengers expect. These aren't perfect, but they're organized, predictable, and built to work under pressure. And number 5 comes from a country better known for precision than warmth. Number 5. Lufthansa. This is an airline built around structure. Everything about it signals order, the process, the language, the way problems are approached. Flying it feels deliberate, as if every step was designed in advance and tested repeatedly. That alone puts it a tier above most of what came before. The core strength here is discipline. Operations are generally tight, decision-making is clear, and when something goes wrong, there's usually a plan, not just apologies. The airline doesn't rush to charm passengers. It focuses on keeping the system working. For many travelers, that's exactly what they want. Where Lufthansa divides opinion is personality. The experience can feel restrained, even stiff. Interactions are professional but rarely warm. Communication is precise, sometimes blunt. You're informed, not reassured. For some, that feels cold. For others, it feels refreshingly honest. The product itself reflects that mindset. Cabins are functional rather than flashy. Comfort is solid, not indulgent. Nothing is designed to impress at first glance. It's designed to hold up over time. On long-haul routes, that practicality can be a real advantage. The airline's biggest challenge isn't quality, but perception. In an era where competitors sell emotion and luxury, Lufthansa sells reliability. That doesn't excite people, but it earns trust. Strikes and internal pressures have tested that image in recent years. Yet the underlying structure remains intact. Flying this airline feels like dealing with a well-run institution, not inspiring, but dependable. And that's why it marks the entry point into the top 5, a carrier that may not make flying feel special, but consistently makes it work. Number 4. KLM. This airline rarely tries to steal the spotlight. And that's exactly why it works so well. Everything about the experience feels measured and intentional. There's no forced charm, no dramatic branding, just an operation that seems built to function smoothly under pressure. A lot of that comes down to how the airline manages flow. Transfers are generally logical, gate changes are communicated clearly, and when schedules tighten, the system tends to absorb stress instead of passing it directly to passengers. You don't feel rushed or confused. You feel guided. Communication is one of its strongest points. Updates are practical, timely, and focused on what actually matters. Instead of vague apologies, you're usually told what's happening and what the next step is. That clarity removes a surprising amount of travel anxiety, especially during disruptions. On board, the experience is understated but comfortable. Crews come across as professional and approachable without feeling scripted or distant. The atmosphere is calm, and the service feels consistent rather than hit or miss. Nothing is designed to impress at first glance. It's designed to hold up over time. The product reflects that philosophy. Cabins are clean, layouts are sensible, and long-haul flights feel predictable in the best way. You know what you're getting, and the airline usually delivers exactly that. No more, no less. Of course, it's not immune to delays or peak season strain. No major carrier is. But when pressure builds, the response tends to be coordinated rather than reactive. Flying KLM feels like dealing with people who value clarity over drama. It may not make flying exciting, but it makes it reliable. And next on the list is an airline shaped by neutrality, understatement, and a long tradition of doing things quietly. Right. No flash, no theatrics. Just a reputation built on calm, order, and not drawing attention to itself. Number 3. Swiss International Airlines. What sets this airline apart isn't how loudly it talks about quality. It's how much thought goes into small things most carriers ignore. From timing to layout to how different parts of the journey connect, the experience feels deliberately engineered rather than patched together. There's a strong sense of balance here. The airline doesn't chase trends or gimmicks, but it also doesn't feel dated. Cabins are designed with practicality in mind, service feels measured rather than rushed, and nothing appears accidental. You get the impression that decisions were made carefully and then left alone to work. One of its biggest strengths is coherence. Flights, transfers, lounges, and onboard service all feel like parts of the same system. There's no sharp drop in quality between short haul and long haul, no feeling that one part of the operation matters more than another. That consistency makes the experience predictable without being boring. Crews tend to be composed and confident, not overly friendly, but clearly attentive. Problems are handled with a focus on resolution rather than explanation. You're not overwhelmed with apologies or processes, things simply move forward. This airline also understands restraint. Comfort is prioritized, but never exaggerated. Premium cabins feel refined rather than flashy. And even economy reflects a sense of care that goes beyond minimum requirements. It's not about luxury, it's about not cutting the wrong corners. Flying Swiss International Airlines feels like dealing with a system that values precision over promises. You don't come away with a story. You come away relaxed, which in modern air travel is increasingly rare. Next comes an airline known for treating food, wine, and cabin style as part of its national identity. From menus curated by famous chefs to a hub that feels more like a fashion statement than a transfer point, flying it is meant to feel distinctly French. Number 2. Air France. For a long time, this airline was easy to mock. Big ambitions, uneven delivery, and a reputation that lagged behind what it wanted to represent. That makes its position here more interesting, because few European carriers have improved as noticeably in recent years. What defines the experience today is intentionality. The airline doesn't just move people across continents, it clearly wants to shape how that journey feels. Food isn't treated as a checkbox. Cabin design isn't generic. Even small details, from presentation to pacing of service, suggest that someone actually thought about the passenger's perspective. The biggest strength lies in long-haul flying. Premium cabins feel modern and cohesive, not stitched together from different eras. Economy isn't luxurious, but it's thoughtfully laid out, and service feels structured rather than rushed. There's a sense that the airline knows where it wants to compete and invests accordingly. Crews are another highlight. Service tends to be confident, sometimes formal, but rarely indifferent. There's personality here. Not forced friendliness, but a sense of pride in delivery. When problems arise, the response feels more engaged than procedural. Flying Air France now feels like encountering an airline that finally aligned its image with its execution. It doesn't always get everything right, but the direction is clear, and the gap between promise and reality has narrowed significantly. And at number 1 is an airline built around a very specific idea of comfort. Think clean design, quiet cabins, and a northern hub designed to make long journeys between Europe and Asia feel shorter than they should. Ready to see the winner? Number 1. Finnair. This airline reached the top by committing fully to a single idea: make long-distance flying feel simpler, calmer, and less exhausting than it has any right to be. Everything about the experience points in that direction, from how routes are planned to how cabins are laid out and how service is delivered. The geographic advantage is obvious, but it's how the airline uses it that matters. Flights between Europe and Asia are structured to minimize travel fatigue, not just flight time. Connections are efficient without feeling rushed, and the overall rhythm of the journey feels carefully paced. You arrive less drained than expected, which is rare. Design plays a huge role here. Cabins are clean, modern, and intentionally quiet. There's very little visual clutter, very little noise, and no attempt to overwhelm passengers with unnecessary features. Comfort comes from space, light, and restraint rather than gimmicks. Service follows the same philosophy. Crews are attentive but unobtrusive. Interactions feel natural, not scripted. You're taken care of without being constantly reminded of it. Even small things, timing of meals, lighting changes, announcements, feel thought through. What really sets this airline apart is consistency. Short haul and long haul feel like parts of the same system. Economy doesn't feel neglected, and premium cabins don't feel indulgent for the sake of it. Everything is aligned around reducing friction rather than adding flash. And that's why it earns the top spot. Not because it tries to impress, but because it understands what modern travelers actually need, and quietly builds the entire experience around that. That's the full ranking, from airlines that consistently disappoint to the ones that actually get the basics right. None of these are perfect, but the differences in how they operate, communicate, and handle problems are very real. If you found this breakdown useful, leave a like. It helps more than you think. And tell me in the comments, which airline surprised you the most on this ranking, and which one would you place differently? Your take might help someone else book smarter. At the end of the day, flying isn't just about price or destination. It's about how the journey actually feels. And once you've had a good experience, it's hard to go back to tolerating a bad one.